Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. We've got an incredibly special show for you today. In Here's the News, we're going to be asking about Trump's charges and corruption more broadly, but we've got a very special guest. Jordan Peterson, the world-renowned clinical psychologist and best-selling author, is here with us today. It's going to be an incredible conversation. I'm going to ask Jordan Peterson about Trump, of course, about the cultural wars, about the success of Sound of Freedom. I'm going to talk to him about censorship. Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us.
It's good to see you, Russell.
We're in a maelstrom. I see that you have adorned yourself in the accoutrements of the harlequin. Is the role of the trickster necessary and integral at a time where authority appears to be melting, authenticity seems to be in decline, and people appear to be demanding new systems, and their faith in the old answers and systems appears to be waning? Are you unconsciously indicating something to us, or very deliberately indicating something to us?
Well, I don't know how much is play conscious and how much is it just something that automatically happens if you're conducting yourself properly. These crazy people at LGFG have made me all sorts of suits, and this one has a wooden tie, by the way, just so you know, and it's supposed to be symbolic of the Native American art that I've been collecting. These are like totem pole patches, essentially. And so, I don't know, they make me these crazy suits, Russell, and it turns out I like them, so I wear them, and it's fun, and that's a good thing, you know?
JP, it's very curious that you have become, over the last 5-10 years, one of the most, it appears, divisive figures in our culture. Certainly that's how your icon and image is utilized. And yet it appears to me that in numerous communities you are regarded as an elder. I feel like I've seen you talk about being called rabbi. I know that you have interesting relationships with Indigenous Canadian folk, or in the territory now known as Canada. Do you think that what we're striving for is a kind of morality, a set of principles that is transcendent of the current cultural divisions that appear to be defining our time? Do we need to find something that akin to universalism to reorganize and reorientate our cultural conversations? Are we in danger of arriving at a time of such enormous fragmentation and divisiveness that it almost makes it impossible to establish systems of governance and consensus even?
Well, the alternative to unity is conflict. Now, unity can become so tight that it turns into tyranny, and obviously that's not acceptable. But the problem with the continual emphasis on diversity that we hear is that it isn't accompanied by the obvious fact that if people aren't united by a vision, let's say, which is how you unite people properly, then they're divided. And divided people can't cooperate or compete peacefully, and their interests run afoul of one another. Now, what's happening on the unity front, as far as I can tell, is that there is a clamor for unity, particularly on the side of the people who are fear-mongering with the apocalypse, and they're trying to compel a unity with terror. And to me, that's a hallmark of tyranny. I think tyrants always use fear to compel unity. What you need to do instead is to provide a unifying vision that people can adopt voluntarily. You know, and you said when you posed that question that I'm a divisive figure, but I actually don't think that's true, Russell. Like, I'm a divisive figure online, but it doesn't seem to be the case in the actual world, because all the interactions I have with people in my actual life in public they're uniformly highly positive. And so I don't think the online world is a very accurate simulacrum of the real world. In fact, I think it's dangerously demented in many ways, and it's giving us a false sense of reality. You know, it's a new sensory system, right? The whole net and our new means of communication. It's a whole new sensory and social system. And there's no reason to assume that it's actually providing a valid representation of the actual world, especially because it also seems to be highly gameable by narcissists and psychopaths. And that's not good. That's not good.
Plainly, it is being used to leverage, engineer, and amplify division. There's no reason to imagine that part of the natural course of a free internet would be new confederacies, decentralization of power, an end to the kind of gargantuan and centralist institutions, both state and corporate, that dominate our systems of power currently. I wonder, before we delve into this subject, which I know is extremely significant and important to you, if you might for a moment comment on the current attempt to indict Donald Trump and what he continues to represent for, you might say, marginalized people, but he's an incredibly popular and populist figure. And those of you watching this on YouTube now will be on for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll be exclusively available on Rumble. Click the link on the description. If you're watching us on Rumble, click the red button now, and you can join us over on Locals. And again, Dr. Peterson, what do you think is the significance of Trump and his ongoing persecution? Do you think he legitimately is an insurrectionist and a criminal in the numerous ways that have been alleged, or do you consider this to be a kind of distraction and an attempt to foreclose on the possibility of a legitimate and a powerful opponent facing Biden in 2024?
Well, I read Victor Davis Hanson's book, The Case for Trump, which I would highly recommend to anyone who's interested in Trump as a phenomenon. And he pointed out, and I think quite rightly, and this is something for those who are sensible on the left to give some consideration to, that the Democrats, especially under Clinton, but it started with Obama, abandoned the American working class, regarded them essentially as deplorables, which is exactly the same thing that happened in Canada under Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, and they turned to Trump. And it's not as if people don't understand that Trump is a bull in a china shop. And I think Robert F. Kennedy is in some ways the same sort of character, but they're actually calling for a bull in the china shop because increasingly people don't trust the overarching centralized institutions that have become too gigantic. You made reference earlier to the fact that there's no necessary reason for us to assume that the internet communication system and information exchange system that we've set up would necessarily tilt towards decentralization and universalization. I think that's absolutely true. It's very difficult to stop a political system from becoming tyrannical. That's the Tower of Babel situation, let's say, or degenerating into chaos. You know, we've seen that with online games. You know, some of those massive online games degenerated into absolute chaos because the rules by which they were constituted turned out not to engender a playable game. And we have no idea if the internet communication system we set up is actually a playable game. We have no idea. Like, look, already we do know some things. About 35% of internet traffic is pornographic. And if you don't think that that's under the control of psychopathic criminals, you're a fool. And then there's absolute, what would you say, lawless West activity on the criminal financial fraud front. I don't think there's an older person in the Western world who isn't targeted once a week by criminals trying to steal their bank accounts. And then, so that's direct criminal activity. That's of the obvious type. Then there's all the online trolls who do nothing but cause trouble and sow divisiveness in their cowardly manner and their LOL culture, trying to do nothing but cause trouble. And we know from the psychological research that those people are much likely to have dark tetrad characteristics. They're Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and because that wasn't good enough, sadistic. And we have no control mechanisms for their proliferation online, right? In face-to-face, people like that get shut down right away, but they have absolutely free reign on the net. And I think not only does that poison the public square in a terrible manner, but it also indicates to people falsely that we're much more divided than we are.
Yes, it appears to me sometimes, Jordan, that anthropology and ethnographics suggest that we all live in manageable communities where the kind of narcissism and sadism that you describe cannot thrive because of the way that relationships break down when you encounter personalities of that type. There is no ability to regulate a culture at this kind of scale. And I know that what you believe in, it seems at least to me, that you believe in new ways of decentralizing power, both corporate and state. I wonder, are you saying something as significant as the nation project has had its demi-millennia, and that it's time to review even the findings and the treasures of the Westphalian Treaty? Is this a time where we review the way that we organize cultures and society? Because it appears to me that the reason that we have these great gargoyles and demons occupying the public stage, vivid caricatures, a vile, lurid and pornographic language, even outside of the erotic, is precisely because we are living in some outgrowth, in some exaggeration, in some unbearable amplification of the type of systems that we might live by. Industrialization, it seems, ultimately introduced a great deal of tyranny, as well as the miracles it delivered. Agriculture, perhaps the same could be said, but we have no contingency for the problems of scale that have been created by this new type of technology. And it seems to me that unless we introduce real measures, as you say, control mechanisms, that the tyranny now is appearing to be inevitable without significant and organized opposition.
Okay, so one of the things you said at the beginning of that was that when you extract relationships out of their local environment, you lose a regulatory function. You lose an implicit regulatory function. So imagine that, you and I have had multiple opportunities to communicate. And one of the things, and we want to sustain that. So one of the things that we do while we're communicating, we might be trying to make our individual points for our own particular purposes. Hopefully, we're trying to do something like investigate the truth, mutually. But in any case, even if our own personal interests did creep into that, if we had any sense, our exchanges would be bounded by the realization that we're going to interact repeatedly for an indefinite amount of time into the future, right? And so that makes us instantly, the dyad that we form, that makes us instantly into an interacting and iterative community. Now, I believe that it's out of iterative interactions that fundamental morality emerges. And there's plenty of game theory that indicates precisely that. Now, see what happens to psychopaths and predators and parasites is that they sacrifice the possibility of a long-term relationship for immediate gratification. And that's not good for them, by the way, because they tend to be very unsuccessful people, and they have to move from victim to victim very rapidly because people cotton on to their games. But they're not bounded by that necessity of responsible, iterated interaction, the same necessity that would govern you if you were in a long-term committed relationship or the relationship that you have with your children. And it's out of that morality springs. Now, if you eradicate that necessity, you disinhibit the psychopaths now and the predators and the parasites. Now, here's why this is such a major problem, and it might be a deadly problem. So the biological struggle is an arms race between parasites and hosts, and always has been. And it's such a profound race that's why sex evolved. Sex evolved because there are creatures that replicate, even some lizards that can replicate essentially by cloning themselves. So they produce identical duplicates of themselves. But what happens is the parasites can optimize for their physiology and take them out. So sex mixes genes. Okay, so the reason I'm saying that is because the parasite problem is so deep and so profound that sex itself evolved as the method of replication to deal with it. Now, the online communication systems facilitate the parasites. And you don't need that many of them to take a society down, like the real radical types who would rather dance around in the chaos and who are in it only for their immediate self-gratification. They're a very small percentage of the population. Clinical data indicates about 3%. But the problem with that is that if they have free rein, they can take everything down. Like they did that in the Russian Revolution, for example. This happens.
That is pretty powerful stuff, Jordan Peterson. Sex emerges as a solution to parasitic entities to introduce a new level of complexity that can outrun this parasitic mentality.
Bye.